God created the heavens and the earth, and less than 2,000 years later, Genesis chapter 7 tells us that the fountains of the great deep burst forth to flood the earth. What water was that from the great deep? Where does all the water come from? To bury the mountains. The water comes from under the crust. So the water comes up, and then gravity, it falls back down as rain for 40 days. If the major source of the floodwaters was from the vapor canopy theory, well then after 40 days the rain stopped. Why did the waters continue to rise for another 110 days? The vapor canopy's out of water. It only have 4 inches anyway. So that check mark there, that's crazy generous. All right, so this comes from Walt's book, The Hydroplate Theory, Key Assumptions. And his main assumption is that there was subterranean water. About half of the water now in the oceans was once under the crust. I think scientifically speaking, he's right to call that an assumption. But how about biblically speaking? Biblically speaking, it's a given. From everything the Bible says, there was subterranean water, and it did flood the earth, and God divided the waters below from the waters above. So this is an assumption, and I think Walt is honorable as a scientist to list it as his primary assumption. There are a couple other assumptions, relatively minor. This is the big one. And if your big assumption is a given because God told you, then that really improves the credibility of your model. And these are the verses that explicitly, that we've gone through, show that Walt's assumption is a given. Okay, catastrophic plate tectonics. This is the model promoted by all the big creation groups for the most part. This is their model. And there's another part of it. It has to do with radioactive decay. You know how atheists and evolutionists look at radioactive elements in the earth and they'll say, well, this uranium decayed to thorium, this decayed to this. So they say, so we know it's been here billions of years. Well, creationists have powerful evidence to refute that claim. And John Baumgartner and these other scientists with ICR and CRS and AIG and CMI, they have done a fabulous job showing that that whole story by the atheist is not true. But they don't know why the radioactive elements are there. They don't know. The reason they don't know is because we had to discover what made them. And I'll try to say it in 3 sentences. It'll be impossible. But when lightning strikes, lightning causes atoms to lose their electrons, and they're squeezed together with such tremendous force, it's called the Z-pinch, that it creates heavy elements. And those heavy elements, they decay within days and weeks, and they're gone. And this is known. When earthquakes happen, there are lightning strikes underground that are the equivalent of a magnitude 7 earthquake, creates about 1 million volts of electricity in a couple seconds. A magnitude 7 earthquake. So lightning causes heavy elements, which is like radioactive elements. When earthquakes happen, there are lightning strikes in the ground, which is well documented. Current research continues, very well documented. So during the global flood, there was more pressure on the granite in the crust than ever since. And so our magnitude 7 earthquake today is nothing compared to the continents being compressed and mountains raising up. There was tremendous force at work on the granite. Granite is made of quartz. This is my 4th complex sentence. Granite is made of quartz, and when you compress quartz or you pull on it, it produces a positive or negative voltage, and that's why all the radioactive elements on the earth, I say all, the vast majority, are in the crust of the continents. It's not under the oceans, it's not in the mantle, it's not in the core. 90% of Earth's radioactivity is in the continental crust. Walt Brown has discovered Not because he's the most brilliant person who ever lived. He might be up there with Isaac Newton, but it's because he had an insight. The insight is the Bible's right when it says that the flood was caused from the fountains of the great deep. They came up from under the rakia. That's it. With that insight, the rest begins to fall into place after a lot of hard work. Would God have created radioactivity in the crust? Not likely. It was a paradise. There'd be no birth defects. But they say if there were all these radioactive elements, there were not before the flood, but if there were, and they decayed rapidly, billions of years worth of decay rapidly, where atoms are shooting out particles, and those atoms become different elements then, and that they might shoot out more. Every time that happens, it produces heat. And all that heat, if it happened during the flood, it would melt the crust of the earth, or nobody could survive. So they say they have a heat problem, and they very much openly say that God solved the heat problem. Now, many of these scientists will say Walt Brown's theory can't be right because it has a heat problem. Well, how can you claim miracles for your own heat problem and then deny them to anyone else? That's not fair. It's special pleading. For God to judge the earth, did he need to erode a certain amount of sediment, or did he need to drown mankind? The floodwaters killed everything that has breath in its nostrils on the face of the earth. So all mankind, except for Noah, his wife, and their 3 sons and daughter-in-laws, everyone was killed. Did it matter if we had a quarter of a mile of sediments, or a mile of sediments, or 5/8 of a mile? It didn't matter. So why would God need to do miracles just to erode sediments? And once you erode it, you have to deposit it. And that takes tremendous turbulent flow, tremendous energy. So where does all that energy come from? With Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, it comes from gravity, which is the first actor pushing down on the subterranean chamber and forcing the water up with tremendous force. But as that's happening, the lightning in the crust, the granite crust of the earth, is producing a sea of neutrons, radioactive elements, and the earth has become basically like a nuclear engine, the subterranean chamber, producing tremendous energy. And then the supercritical water, once water gets a certain pressure and temperature, it no longer behaves like a liquid. It doesn't behave like a gas. It behaves like something else. And it is shocking, the things that it's able to do regarding temperature and erosion. And this is well documented. It's used in industry. So the hydroplate theory is just a recipe for how you erode all the sediments on the earth. It's obvious. They came from the subterranean chamber, and when the water was coming up, they ruptured 10 miles high with cliffs on each side eroding away. So the erosion didn't come from the surface of the earth. You can't do it. You can't erode that much from the surface. If the continents did crush the subterranean chamber, what kind of energy, how turbulent would the water become? You know, we have a little earthquake and a tsunami that kills 100,000 people. Well, what if instead of a little earthquake, what if North America fell 3/4 of a mile down toward the mantle? How much energy would that release on the crust of the earth? Quite a bit. And that's only part of the energy of the hydroplate theory. When God made the earth as rock, as you go deep below the surface, the pressures become so intense that a term plasticity, rock begins to flow like putty. And the pressures are so great, if you think about it, when you're 10 miles below the crust, you have the weight on top of you pushing down. You have what's below wanting to go up, if it could. And you have, because of gravity, the rest of the sphere of the earth around you is pushing in on you. The pressure is enormous. A crack is not able to open up at those pressures. A microscopic crack would have to open up for then water to come out of that subterranean chamber and begin to break through the crust. what God did when he made the subterranean chamber is he created this hydraulic system, which was brilliant, and he fine-tuned it in such a way that it functioned perfectly the way we see fine-tuning in every other aspect of what God made. The fine-tuning of the physical constants of the universe stun the atheist. They are stunned by it. And how is everything so perfect? If you study the water cycle, young kids in school, homeschool, they study the water cycle. Scientists have written entire books on the brilliance and the uncanny perfection of the balancing of all the constants and the physical forces that are necessary for us to have a water cycle. Who would have thought it, right? It evaporates, comes down. And so for God to be able to build the earth with waters under the crust that are waiting there in storehouses for judgment if mankind turned against him, God can do that. And the physics don't say that he couldn't have. The physics are reinforcing the fact that this would be a stable construct for God to design the earth, not only with the water, but with the pillars, the foundations of the earth that were sunk into the bases over days 2 and 3. I've mentioned supercritical water. That's when water gets hot enough and enough pressure, and it behaves very different than a solid, liquid, or gas. Well, at this conference, Stephen Austin said this, and I've been noticing this for 10 years. Our creation scientists, they make so much progress when they see what Walt Brown has been doing, and they say, oh yeah, let's try that. Stephen said, supercritical water is very friendly to the creationist view. We should all look for this and how it behaves at depth. Deep below the crust of the earth, supercritical water will help explain what happened during the flood. This is Walt Brown, 7 years earlier in his book, in the beginning on his website. During the flood, supercritical water accelerated out of the chamber. This tremendous acceleration expanded the spacing between water molecules, allowing flash evaporation, sudden cooling, and erosion, and so on. So where does all the water come from to bury the mountains? The water comes from under the crust. We've already discussed how in radioactive decay, there's an alpha particle, and that thing will cause birth defects. And that's all over the world today. Thankfully, if you look at the crust of the earth, the crust of the continents, that's where all the radioactivity is, mostly. But it's relatively rare, thankfully. But it is on the continents. Atheists say the funniest things. We interviewed theoretical physicist, emphasis on the theoretical, Lawrence Krauss from ASU. He's best friends with Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing, and the Discovery Channel made a special out of it. So we created a little spot on our website, rsr.org/Watsa. So with all that, there was one point where Lawrence Krauss agreed with me that radioactivity and granitic crust go together, like hand and glove, like peanut butter and jelly, like Peyton Manning and the Broncos. Okay, so he agreed with me on this point on radioactivity, which he's so disagreeable, and so for him to agree is significant.
Study. So again, once again,
all right. No, on this, I think I know very much what I'm talking about. 90% of the Earth's radioactivity is in the crustal rock of the continents.
That's a true statement.
Okay. So, finally, right? So why is it there? If those heavy elements were formed in supernova, Larry Krauss blasphemes Jesus Christ when he says, forget Jesus, a star died so you could live. That's what he says.
So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Okay? And anyway, he's great.
Now, he's wrong even scientifically, because this year, the journal Nature has published that we now know that supernovas can't create the heavy elements. Everything heavier than iron, which means most of the elements, they can't make them in supernovas. there's not enough energy, there's not enough temperature, there's not enough pressure, there's not enough neutrons. And they look at the light, they're not making heavy elements like they thought. We've all been told that stars explode and they make all the elements that are in our bodies. Well, they can only make the elements up to iron. So why are all those elements here? Chemical evolution cannot answer where do the heavy elements come from. The National Academy of Sciences, which is America's most prestigious body of atheistic Darwinist scientists, they published the 11 greatest questions for physics just a few years ago. And question number 4 or 5 was, how did heavy elements form? They don't know. Wouldn't that be a shock to most people who watch the Discovery Channel and listen to Science Friday on NPR? They'd be shocked. They thought they figured it all out. Rate heat problems solved by miracles, that's the claim, right? Yeah, but after the flood, the earth wasn't just the right temperature, like a Goldilocks, just right temperature. It was way too cold. Glaciers, millions of square miles of frozen muck called loess or lurs. The Ice Age. If God was going to remove the problem of the heat, well then why did he remove so much heat? He could have done it just perfectly. The Ice Age was a result of the consequences of the flood. After the flood, the world wasn't too hot, but too cold. So look for a flood model with processes that systematically remove heat. The hydroplate theory removes heat. The fusion of heavy elements, when lightning creates heavier elements, this has been done in the lab by scientists thousands of times. They produce electric currents that are like lightning bolts, tremendously finely focused on a micro dot. And the temperature gets so hot, we talk about the sun, how hot that is. This gets, in the laboratory, 640 million degrees for like a millionth of a second. And it produces, out of normal elements like iron or gold or other elements, it produces uranium and thorium and polonium and radon and all the heavy elements. It produces all of them. They've been doing this thousands of times, and it's a stunning advance in nuclear physics to realize that when you have sufficient electrical current focused in a Z-pinch way, you create heavy elements. And not only do they create heavy elements, in the earth, there's a certain amount of this element, a certain amount of that element. There's 60 heavier elements, heavier than iron or so. Well, they produce those elements in the lab by accident in about the same proportions that they exist in the crust of the earth. So that is just astounding evidence that those heavy radioactive elements came from the global flood and the electrical discharges in the crust during the flood. So fusion of heavier elements, oh, by the way, when that happens, the whole lab should melt down, But they say the process is adiabatic. The process, it doesn't melt down the equipment, it absorbs heat. Because when you make a uranium atom from smaller atoms, because their electrons are stripped away and the nucleus are squeezed together so tightly, it overcomes the Coulomb force that wants to shoot like particles apart, protons. Like you have an atom, 2 protons, 2 neutrons. Why doesn't it fly apart? It wants to by the electromagnetic Coulomb force, but the strong force holds it together. And when the atom nucleus becomes too big, it's real heavy, like uranium, the nucleus is so big that the strong force can't hold on to all the protons and the neutrons. The Coulomb force then, because the distance is so great, they measure it in barns, the distance is so great that the strong force loses hold of some protons and neutrons and they shoot out. And that's why we have radioactivity. So in lightning and in this Proton 21 laboratory, They focus this electrical current on pieces of iron or whatever they use, and as long as it's relatively pure, and they produce all these heavy elements. And they call it cold repacking because it takes energy to make those heavy elements. So in a nuclear power plant with fission, we are generating a lot of heat. If you're using fusion and you're building heavier elements by smashing atoms together, you are absorbing heat. So you take all that radioactive decay that the rate team and CPT thinks they have a problem with, and most of it went into the creation of Earth's radioactivity. The heavy elements were made with that heat energy. There's more to the story, of course. Supercritical water expansion, converting energy, heat energy into kinetic energy by launching the fountains of the great deep through the atmosphere and the rocks and the water going out to become the comets and asteroids. That also removed a lot of heat. Kinetic conversion of heat to kinetic energy and supercritical water expansion jetting into space.
Many people think that the biblical flood of Noah was abandoned because of the evidence. However, history tells a different story. Modern geological thought owes much to a man named Charles Lyell. Lyell, a lawyer, published a book in 1830 called Principles of Geology. Described as a masterpiece of persuasion, it changed the way people thought about Earth's past. According to Lyell, we should only appeal to today's geological processes to explain Earth history. However, this approach meant that the global flood recorded in the Bible was automatically ruled out of consideration. Lyell wanted, he wrote, to free the science of geology from Moses. Regrettably, many people have uncritically adopted Lyell's philosophy without considering how Noah's flood can help us understand Earth history. Lyell changed the way many people think, but his approach was motivated by his anti-biblical philosophy. Indeed, it is very difficult to explain Earth's history without Noah's flood.